Good morning. Just trying to do a quick hangout just to respond to G plus guy named Pierre, or who goes by Pierre Dunker. He's a Christian. He responded to uh, what's become a really long thread on a video called Funny Things Atheists Say with William Lane Craig. William Lane Craig in the video challenged some atheists that he was debating with to provide evidence that they would accept for the existence of God. And I don't think that the video, or maybe it was an audience member that challenged the atheists that way. It's been a while since I've actually watched the video. My original post was from November of 2013, so it's almost 2 years ago that that I put up this post. And anyways, I won't go into all that because I think that the relevant conversation, really has gone beyond that. So I'm scrolling down to where Pierre and I joined in, um, and we were discussing um, prayer and whether or not there are miracles. Pierre's been a really nice guy. There have been people on here uh, who've been rude, and uh, I think that my initial post wasn't articulated very clearly, uh, and that's evidenced by the confusion about my intent and meaning. But Pierre and I've had a fairly decent conversation. We've gone a little bit back and forth. So I asked him, do you believe that you have a personal relationship with the creator of the universe? And he says yes. Uh, I asked, do you have conversations you believe? How do you know the conversations you believe you are having with your God are not simply your own thoughts? Kind of went down that path for a while. There must be at least part of you that does not want to do the things. Oh, he was saying if there was no God, then um, he would want to do terrible things. And I said, well, if that was the case, there's got to be at least part of you that um, doesn't want to do those things, and that because you wouldn't be glad that you know you have a God who helps you to avoid doing terrible things, if that were the case. So and he said, well, look, this spark of morality that is contained within us comes from God, the God of the Bible. And I said, well, if that's true, and kind of here's where uh, we're getting to the point. And I said, well, that same internal sense of right and wrong that was responsible for my rejection of the Bible. So this same spark of kind of moral character and values that I have, that Pierre is pointing to, saying, well, this is clearly from God, because otherwise we would want to do terrible things. When I read the Bible, that same moral sense condemns the the God of the Bible, because I think that he's doing evil things. I think he gives evil commands, and I think that the Bible is immoral in many places. And they said, well, was it moral when Yahweh gave the Israelites the law that includes Exodus 21:20, which says that slave owners can beat their slaves so long as the slave can stand up after 2 days, because the slave is his property and he's done nothing wrong by beating him. Um, Psalm 137 verse 9 says, happy is the man who smashes the babies against the rocks. I go on and I said, Joshua slaying Achan and his whole family because he broke a temporary rule in Joshua chapters 7 and 8. And then King David, from 2 Samuel chapter 12, who brings over Bathsheba, who is Uriah's wife, and then sleeps with her. So he's committed adultery, which is universally wrong and pretty much wrong in every culture around the world. He tries to deceive and trick Uriah to cover up his crime, which is universally wrong. There's no exceptions to where that's sometimes okay. He eventually conspires to have Uriah killed, which is he's conspiring to commit murder um, to hide his crime. So several things that David did that were immoral in all cases in pretty much every culture. And unlike Achan, who did something that was only wrong in that one instance, in other instances, what Uriah did would have been perfectly fine. And in fact, the very next situation where Israel attacked a town, they were allowed to do the thing that Achan did, that caused not only him but his entire family to be stoned to death. Then you take David, and and David was basically got a slap on the wrist, said one of your children will die, and um, whatever. But he doesn't lose the throne, so he retains power. He retains his life. Most of his family is alive. None of his family is instantly killed. He has multiple wives. None of his wives are killed. Um, so it's just a very, very off kilter system of justice. And I challenged Pierre and said, if David was Obama and Achan was just a normal soldier today, and they had gone about and done the things that were wrong that Achan and David did, but it was Obama and some just peon soldier, I said, would you accept their respective punishments as just or moral? Um, I'm going to take this moment just to point to Reese Witherspoon. While I agree with you on some of your points, I think that your tone, you tend to be kind of insulting in things, is not helpful. It's in fact, I think it's counterproductive. So there was at least one of your comments that I deleted entirely because it really didn't have anything productive to say at all. It was only uh, an insult. I really wish that um, you would not use my comment threads to insult people. Um, I don't think that I don't think it's a good idea in general, and I don't think it's productive if you are actually interested in carrying on a conversation that influences people or changes people's minds. But anyhow, Pierre responded, and this is the reason for this whole hangout. So we're a few minutes in, but this is the bottom line. This is why I wanted to use this hangout to respond. So Pierre says, sorry for not responding right away. No problem at all. This has taken me a few days to respond, and we all have busy lives and things. So Exodus 21:20, he is addressing here. He says the particular verse you're addressing with regards to the rights of a slave. I don't see it that way. I see it as the rights of the slave owner to beat his slave. Being beaten so badly that you can't even stand up for 2 days. I don't consider that rights. That's and I mean, I guess it's rights in that if he's beaten worse than that, there's some unspecified punishment that should be handed down. Even if the slave loses his life, it doesn't. It doesn't. The chapter doesn't give the same penalty for a slave being killed that it does for all of the other instances where free people are killed. If you look back at that chapter 20 or 21 rather, um, it lists all different kinds of crimes and things that you would get the death penalty for, um, including like insulting their parents, striking, someone and killing them if it's a free person. But when it comes to a slave being killed, it simply says the slave owner should be punished. Well, that's left up to judges to interpret. The judges were, if you read in the book of Judges, they were notoriously corrupt. Um, there was no accountability, and there, I don't even think that there was an appeals system, so that whatever a judge said, who was appointed, there was nepotism because the priests would appoint their children as judges. Their children were corrupt and spoiled. Um, I I strongly suspect that there was, uh, bribery and things like that. What's to say that any of this was ever actually enforced? If there was any punishment, I don't. I'm very doubtful that that's the case in a system that was so corrupt and had so little accountability, that there was any punishment given to someone that killed a slave at all, um, regardless of what the law may or may not have said. Um, so, anyhow, Pierre continues on. Exodus talks about this process because they were slaves that were liberated from Egypt. Um, I'll just say this: there's no evidence that Israelites were ever in Egypt apart from what's captured in um, the book of Exodus. Really, um, there's no archaeological evidence. There's no evidence in Egyptian hieroglyphs in Egypt, of a large emancipation of slaves. There's no evidence of any of the plagues. But let's assume, for the sake of conversation, that this is really true. That this story happened. Um, so they were slaves, and now Yahweh has liberated them and brings them and gives them a law. Why include slavery? Why was that necessary? So Pierre continues on. The population of Jews had to be educated and reformed because they knew nothing else than being slaves for so long. So God pointed Moses, I think you mean appointed, and what you read in Exodus and Deuteronomy were the first books of laws made for the Jews. As for every human being, education starts gradually, not from zero to your last class in the university. If you've been a slave all your life, you need a changing process that becomes less a slave and more free. Okay, so how does allowing for the institution of slavery among people who had been slaves accomplish this? And what is it that you mean by that? They were slaves, and now Yahweh is continuing to allow them to be slaves. So that's the first question. The second question is it right? I mean, is it moral and just to allow for slavery? If not, why didn't he say no slavery? Um, they were slaves in Egypt, so some of them had to be slave masters, and some of them had to be slaves. That doesn't make any sense to me at all, Pierre. Um, anyhow, um, moving on. Let's see. In our recent history, we saw that the abolition of slavery was a process. Okay. Um, the change is drastic. The same thing applies when it comes to organizing a population by means of law. I hope I answered your question. Um, no. And here's why as well, because there's an additional reason why. What you're suggesting is that slavery is in fact wrong. Why is there nothing in all of the Old Testament and New Testament that says slavery as an institution is immoral and corrupt? And even though we allowed for it back here in Old Testament times, the ideal is no slavery. Slave masters, if you are Christians, you should free your slaves. It's not there. Um, and and the institution of slavery is embraced throughout. Even if you want to say that, okay, well, slavery was needed for whatever social reason, why would it have to be slavery where the slaves are allowed to be beaten, um, to within an inch of their lives, so they can't stand up for a couple of days? Why allow them to be beaten at all? Um, there are other verses that indicate that uh, the slave masters were allowed to sleep with their female slaves as long as the female slave wasn't promised to be married to someone else and eventually freed. Um, why was that necessary? We would consider that statutory rape now if even someone's boss insisted that his underling um, commit sexual acts with him or whatever. Um, you know, I think our rules and our laws are better than the laws and rules that were supposedly handed down from this deity. And when you compare the laws that govern the Hebrews back in that time with other civilizations and cultures that were in that same area, they're really very comparable. So it seems much more likely to me that these people were just kind of borrowing from the conventional wisdom at the time, than it does that there was some supernatural insight contained in the laws that were given to Moses, or supposedly given to Moses. Um, okay, so this passage in Psalms, or the verse in Psalms they point to, it's a prayer by an unknown or unknown authors in different circumstances. Many of them in joy, others also in oppression and hope. So there's lots of different emotions going on. In times when sacrifices were very common in their vocabulary, uh, they used this also in Psalms, later in the Old Testament, how God condemned these sacrifices. Well, this is well beyond when, the the book of Psalms. These, I don't think, were ancient writings, um, and in fact, I think they were specifically talking about that the Babylonians um, in that passage. Um, but the verse specifically says, "Blessed is the one who smashes your babies against the rocks," or "happy" in some translations. Um, the that's what the verse says. So either you have to say the verse is wrong and that doesn't bring happiness or blessing, or there are some circumstances where Yahweh would bless people who smash babies on rocks. I just don't think that there's any other way around that. Yeah, I think that you should go back and look at the context of that verse again and just ask yourself, is it actually good to smash babies on rocks, in some cases at least, or not? My position is that it's never good to smash babies on rocks. Joshua 7 and 8. The book of Joshua was the last step to, I guess, achieve God's promise. to the nation of Israel. The promised land describes their wars and conquests of the land under God's guidance and Joshua's leadership. Besides this, God was also combating the evil that man allowed in their lives. So there is God's love to lead his people. How is marauding through lands where there are existing populations and slaughtering them love in any way, shape, or form? I mean, if God is all powerful, he could have just, put fear into the people's hearts and sent them scattering to other places, have them run away. I mean, populations immigrate all the time. Throughout history, there's evidence that this has gone on. Why wasn't Yahweh just shooing the people away? He could have made them see a hallucination of a wall of flame, and they could have run away. There's all sorts of different things. Even just causing them all to drop dead. Just he could have just stopped their hearts and whatever. But instead, he has his people going through there, just like many other cultures around the world throughout history, and butcher thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people. It just seems like this is an excuse to carry out the same kinds of acts that were done by other cultures. And if we saw it going on today and someone tried to tell us, well, a God told us this was okay, we wouldn't take them seriously. We would say, no, this is what you're doing is evil. But when you read it in this book, and it's the same kind of stuff, you were willing to accept the idea that a God told these people that it was okay to do that. I think you were holding the Bible to different standard than you would other situations. Robbery is evil. Well, Achan was stealing from dead people, and it was a defeated enemy. And in some cases that was allowed, and in other cases it wasn't allowed. So, and I don't think that the do not steal from your neighbor applies in this case, because it wasn't his neighbor. It was someone that was dead. And you're saying, Pierre is saying, it's even worse when you commit that against the authority of God. Well, I mean, it's the authority of Joshua, who was claiming to have the authority of God, or a God. God also saw by committing evil, the soldier's focus would be affected and lead to self-destruction. At the end, people stoned Achan and his family, not God. People did that, yes, but that was the decision made by Joshua, who supposedly had the authority of the God. So this was the penalty. So if you believe that the command not to steal stuff came from God through Joshua, then the command to slaughter his family and stone them all to death also came from that same source, Joshua, or Yahweh through Joshua. So the punishment came from Yahweh if you are going to take the other, commands and things seriously. Let's see. In that time, these ways people punished for most common ways of law enforcement. Right. But again, was it a good way to punish people? Was it just? We now in our culture have rules such as trial by jury. We have appeals process, so that if you think you got a corrupt judge, or a situation where the jury was corrupt, or there was a problem with the presentation of the evidence and things, you can appeal. We're not subjected to cruel and unusual punishments. People's families aren't held accountable. Their extended relatives and things, when they commit a crime. So a soldier who stole from someone, Al Qaeda uh, in Afghanistan or something, his family, even if he wasn't supposed to steal from the enemy in a given circumstance or something, his family could not be held accountable for something that he did. And certainly not his children. If his wife had conspired and tried to cover up or something, um, the children would not be held accountable for what their parents did. In the case of Achan, first of all, there's no evidence or nothing in the narrative that suggests that his wife was in on it. Achan confesses the same way David does, but instead of just a slap on the wrist, or a threat that one of his children will die or his wife will miscarry or something like that, um, he and his whole family are stoned to death. This is a clear case, looking at these two instances of David and Achan, where justice is completely different for the one who's in power. And when that happens in the real world today, when people in power, and I've heard Christians argue this way and say, well, that happens all the time. Yes, it does, but we don't accept it as just or moral. And when you look at the Bible, it's the same thing that's going on, but you accept it as just and moral just because it's in the Bible and someone said that a God was responsible for it. But it's the same stuff that we in everyday life look at and say there's corruption. Let's see. When it comes to what David did to Uriah at the end of the story, but the thing David has done displeased the Lord, that states that whoever you are, whatever you do, you will have to be held accountable to your deeds at the end of times. Okay, well, in some cases, it's important to do it right away, like in Achan with his whole family. And in other cases, it's going to come in the future. Why is that? Whether you're president or pope, that is God's justice. That's not justice. Justice, if we ran our justice system like this, people would be outraged. Anyways, continue to think about these things, Pierre. Look back at what you wrote. Think about what I've said here, and ask yourself. I mean, you can look at any given situation, from any religious text or any historical account, and if you applied the same kinds of arguments that you were applying to justify what's going on in the Bible, you could justify anything. You could look at a serial killer, and if you said, well, a God told him to do that, he was within the bounds of the law, God's law, or whatever the case, by the kinds of arguments that you were making, there is no sense of what is right and wrong, in a truly objective way. You are molding and crafting morality and justice to fit the Bible, rather than taking a standard, a set of principles that can be applied universally in all times and in all places, and saying, this is what is right and wrong. This is how we can evaluate any kind of act as right or wrong. You're taking a very flexible and noodly approach to uh, justice when it comes to the Bible. And I was doing the same thing. And when I realized that that's what I was doing, because I went to some of the other religious texts, and I was also concerned about, our own laws and things, and trying to place and figure out how could I recognize justice, so that as when I was a believer, as a Christian, that I could advocate for justice within a society where I have a voice as a citizen in a democracy. So anyhow, think about these things. I'm sorry I didn't write out a response. This was just easier and a little less time consuming for me. I just had 30 minutes or so. So I've got to run. I hope that my response makes some sense to you, and take some time to think about it. Take care. Thank you.